Hi, everyone, and welcome to Decisions, Adopting Behavioral Economics into Pharmaceutical and Consumer Healthcare Research. This is Allison Gutkowski. I'm the Director of Global Research at HCD, and we're very lucky to have Erin Carbone joining us today. As a previous market research analyst and HCDer, Erin is now a doctoral candidate at Carnegie Mellon University, where she studies behavioral economics. Erin holds a BA in psychology and economics from Barnard College, Columbia University, as well as an MPA in policy research and analysis from Pitt, and an MA in international relations from the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. While we're unfortunately not able to cover the entire discipline of behavioral economics and its relation to healthcare in just one short hour, Erin's going to bring you through a high-level overview of some of the key theories and tools of behavioral economics. We'll follow this up with a brief case study and finally field some questions. And I do encourage you throughout the presentation to ask any questions in the Q&A section of the webinar platform. Kathryn Ambroze, who's also on as well, will help us be fielding those questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And we hope you enjoy and you learn something new today. And with that, Erin, please take it away.
Hi, thanks so much, Allison, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining today to talk about behavioral economics. I don't normally sound this raspy. I'm just getting over a cold. Great timing, but I hope you can bear with me and my voice for the next 25 minutes or so. So as Allison mentioned, I'm going to be taking you through a brief overview of the field of behavioral economics. And then I'll be providing you with specific insights from the field that can be applied to some of the work that you all do. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So what is behavioral economics? As I have represented here quite literally, it is the intersection of psychology and economics. At the core of economic theory is the idea that markets are made up of rational economic actors. So these are individuals who know exactly what it is they want. They have concrete, stable, inherent preferences between all the available options. And they have the knowledge and capacity to go about maximizing their utility or their overall well-being and happiness, given those preferences. So behavioral economics represents a departure from these sort of normative models of what rational actors do, and presents instead a realistic view of what actual real-world economic actors do. So we're going to be talking today about more descriptive models of behavior. So real-world economic actors, people like you and me, we violate these norms of behavior on a daily basis. Fortunately, most people tend to make the same, quote, errors, and we sort of violate these norms in very systematic and predictable ways. So by updating economic models to reflect what we know about humans and human idiosyncrasy, we can make predictions about how consumers actually behave under different real-world conditions. We can figure out when and how they'll deviate from optimality, and we can ultimately help inform marketing strategy and brand positioning. So why is it that people act irrationally? Well, one important reason for this is that we're what we call cognitive misers. So we have very limited attention and scarce cognitive resources. So we're really eager to conserve these whenever possible. So we can do this by employing heuristics. These are cognitive shortcuts that help us arrive at fast judgments by doing things like considering fewer alternatives or considering less information about those alternatives. In some instances, these heuristics can be really efficient, but at other times, they lead to exactly the types of biases we're going to be talking about today. So for the purposes of today's talk, I've categorized psychological biases into 3 distinct types. And these categories are loosely related to the structure of the next section of this presentation. So the first category we've already touched upon. These include the biases that directly follow from the fact that people are what we call boundedly rational, and the fact that we replace deliberative conscious thought with heuristics. So in these cases, individuals are either unable or unmotivated to process the information in a way that leads to an optimal outcome. Another category of biases concerns the fact that features of the environment can exert a dramatic influence on the decisions that people make, and not always for the better. And finally, as soon as we introduce a time factor into decision-making, we run into issues like present bias and projection bias and self-control issues. And these can either prevent people from making the best decision in the moment or prevent them from acting in their own best interests over time. So an important question is, what does this mean for your business? So the first implication stems from the fact that factors outside of people's conscious awareness can have a significant impact on judgment. So this can lead patients and physicians to make different choices in different environments, some of which will, of course, be suboptimal. And then additionally, even in instances when consumers or physicians have made good decisions, biases can impact their product utilization or prescribing behavior over a longer time horizon and impede their ability to follow through on the decisions that they've made. So there exists a huge opportunity for companies to intervene and improve the experience and outcomes of their customers. Another implication that this has is for the effectiveness of a firm's effort to encourage behavior change or specific purchasing decisions. So these approaches typically involve things like messaging. So this can be product branding, positioning, even safety warnings, things like financial incentives, so sales and coupons, cigarette taxes are all considered financial incentives. And then from the policy side, mandates and bans, so vaccination requirements or the banning or regulation of certain drugs. So without taking psychological biases into account, one will likely fail to maximize the impact of these different approaches. So behavioral economics can inform and complement, and in some cases even supplant some of these efforts, and can be leveraged to encourage consumers to make different and better decisions. So in what follows, we're going to talk a bit about exactly this. So we're going to talk about how behavioral economics can be leveraged to influence preferences in purchasing and prescribing decisions, and then how we can help patients and physicians follow through on these decisions. So let's begin. This first topic will probably resonate with many of you. So this is the power of habit in purchasing and prescribing behavior. In the world of medicine and healthcare in particular, there's a great deal of uncertainty and a level of specialization that is necessary to make informed decisions. So to conserve cognitive effort, people might employ a heuristic rather than make a conscious deliberative decision about what is the most appropriate way to handle their current situation. So the mechanism that underlies many of these heuristics is what we call attribute substitution. So this is basically just a fancy way of saying that when posed with one question, people actually tend to answer a related but fundamentally different and easier question without even realizing it. To see this at work, let's consider an individual who's experiencing a health problem. In this case, a stomach ache. In my case, a cold. But we'll stick to the woman with the stomach ache. So the question that this woman intends to answer is, what exactly am I experiencing, and what medication is most appropriate for this condition? But the question she might actually answer instead is, what medication relieved me of similar symptoms in the past? So she thinks about a time in the past when she had a similar problem, and she thinks about whether or not she eventually felt better. And if so, she thinks about how it was remedied. So she'll just repeat her previous actions. She'll use the same remedy, despite the fact that this might not actually be the most effective way to manage the condition. So similarly, imagine that this patient presents to her doctor with these same symptoms. So here, the question of diagnosis, it requires the physician to take note of her symptoms, to consider which conditions these symptoms are suggestive of, to consider the base rates for the potential conditions, both generally and conditional on her specific demographic characteristics and environmental factors, et cetera, et cetera. Then after arriving at a diagnosis, he should think about all the possible medications that are indicated for that condition and consider the features that distinguish them from one another to arrive at the appropriate prescription. So an alternative to this cognitively intense procedure is to think about the patient's symptoms more holistically and to determine how similar she is either to patients he's seen previously or to a kind of mental schema of patients with different conditions that he's formed based on his experience and training. He can then just replicate actions he's taken in the past when he was presented with such patients. As with the previous slide, this might not lead to the optimal course of action. So the behavior described on the previous slide relies on what is known as the representativeness heuristic. So this is when one evaluates the extent to which an entity is representative of a group or a category, and then uses that assessment of similarity to determine the likelihood that the entity is in fact a member of that group. So the quintessential example of this heuristic from behavioral economics is the so-called Linda problem. So back in the day, when this study was first published, participants were presented with the following passage. Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. It's a little dated. I don't know that there are too many anti-nuclear demonstrations happening now, but I think you get the idea. So these participants are then asked, which is more probable? That Linda is a bank teller, or that she's a bank teller and also active in the feminist movement. So here, most people succumb to what is known as the conjunction fallacy. So a feminist bank teller is a part of a subcategory of the larger group of bank tellers. So it can never be more likely that she is a member of this smaller group. But that is how most people respond, because she just seems more representative of someone who is a feminist. Another factor that is likely at play in the scenarios described above is implicit association. So whenever someone is exposed to a stimulus, in this case, a sick patient or physician considering a medication, that exposure activates system one processing, a term that you've probably heard. This is their intuitive or automatic thinking. And it activates their semantic network, which is a web of, an interconnected web of knowledge that they have about the stimulus. This activation effectively primes related concepts that are stored in the brain, and this facilitates subsequent retrieval of those concepts. So the associations that exist between stimuli and attributes sort of happens automatically with the accumulation of experience with a product over time. But these instant reactions based on these associations can have powerful effects on decision-making. So importantly, these implicit attitudes are beneath human consciousness, and they might not be aligned with how an individual explicitly describes their rational, deliberative thoughts about the product. This distinction is really important because as we've been talking about, there's a heavy reliance on habit and routine in decision-making, and that is much more likely to rely on the affective response that is sort of a direct result of these associations. So the affective response can be much more predictive of their behavior than what they say once they've had time or been explicitly asked to think about it. So fortunately, we have at our disposal the implicit association test, which is a measure of the strength and certainty of the associations between stimuli and different concepts. So this test takes advantage of the fact that related concepts are primed and readily accessible in memory. People are faster to react to the appearance of key attributes or emotions that they believe are related or that they have associated in memory to the stimulus compared to those concepts that are not related. So we've established how relying on routine and habit might alleviate the cognitive burden placed on decision makers. Behavioral economists have also revealed a second explanation for why people will continue making the same purchase or prescription decisions over and over again. And that is to avoid the unpleasantness or the disutility of loss. So to understand this concept, I'll need to introduce you to prospect theory, which is one of the most foundational theories in the discipline. So I'll cover this at a very high level, and I promise that this is the most theoretical this talk will get. So prospect theory is basically an account of how people's utility, again, that's their well-being or their happiness, is affected by changes from their status quo in terms of gains and in losses. So consider for a moment someone who is faced with a gamble. So they can either win or lose a lot of money. So in this first scenario, let's imagine that they have won a certain amount of money. Now, winning this money brings them a measurable level of happiness. Suppose, however, that the gamble did not work out in their favor and they instead lost the exact same amount of money. So this obviously brings them a level of disutility. But we see from this graph that the slope in the realm of losses is much steeper, and the resulting disutility from the loss is actually larger than the utility from a gain of the exact same size. So we call this phenomenon loss aversion, and it has really important implications for decision making. So consider a patient who is currently using product A with the option of switching to product B. The products are equivalent in terms of efficacy, but they differ in that product A has a more user-friendly delivery system and product B has a faster onset of action. Suppose also that onset of action is objectively more important in determining well-being than delivery system is. So you could say that product B is actually a better option, objectively speaking. The problem is that because of loss aversion, the trade-off between products A and B entails giving up the intuitive delivery system that the person has sort of come to enjoy and feels that they have, and giving that up is coded as a loss. So the gain associated with switching to product B would need to be very large to compensate for this loss and to overcome the reluctance to switch products. So we call this phenomenon status quo bias. So we'll just conclude this section on habits simply by saying that understanding the underlying drivers of behavior is a critical first step to disrupting existing consumption and prescription habits and to helping patients and physicians make better decisions. So we've discussed the challenges associated with breaking these habits and encouraging conscious consideration of alternatives. In this next section, we're going to assume that we've achieved that goal and talk about the impact of the decision context on a decision outcome. So research has shown that people's preferences can be very unstable and vary dramatically from context to context. An important thing to remember is that there is always an environmental feature or features present that will exert some influence on the decision. So it would sort of behoove you as marketers and market researchers and brand strategists to leverage the insights from behavioral economics to make these influences work for your product. This is the idea behind the concept of nudges. So some of you may have read the book Nudge, or perhaps you've heard about nudge units in government. But nudges are basically changes to features of what we call the choice architecture, the environment in which a choice is made, that encourage one outcome or one behavior over others. So this can be accomplished either by restructuring the choice through a modification of the options that are presented, or by changing the way that choices are described. So we'll discuss both of these in turn. So first, in terms of choice structure. So consider a choice between two medicinal products that are being evaluated in terms of two attributes, price and efficacy. Product A is cheap, and of moderate efficacy. And product B is highly effective, but you pay a steep price for that efficacy. So in this scenario, some consumers might not see the value in paying that much more for, let's say, a marginal increase in efficacy, and perhaps they prefer the cost-effective option. So now suppose that you introduce into this market a third option, option C. So this option is more expensive than product B, but it is not as effective. So this creates a situation of what we call asymmetric dominance. Product B is superior than product C on all relevant attributes, and product A is only more cost effective than this new attribute. It's not as effective. It can't even compete. So this has the effect of actually shifting preferences away from product A toward product B, even though none of the features of either of those two products have changed in any meaningful, inherent way. So here is a real world, albeit non-healthcare related example that I think really nicely demonstrates the decoy effect in practice. So this was the actual pricing scheme for The Economist magazine for some time. And it seems a bit counterintuitive. If you look at the latter two options, they are priced identically, but one is clearly superior than the other. So some researchers were trying to understand why on earth they would offer this middle option. So they ran a study asking participants to choose their preferred option. And not surprisingly, no one chose the print subscription only. What is surprising, however, is that when the researchers removed that middle option, preferences for the remaining options reversed. So the middle option actually served as a decoy that made the more expensive, but also more comprehensive print and web subscription look much more appealing. So that was an example of how nudges can be used to restructure the choice task. The second type of nudge that one can employ is to modify the way that different products are described. So it turns out that framing or minor modifications in the language that's used to describe different options can dramatically change perceptions and ensuing behavior. So here we're going to put our newly acquired knowledge of loss aversion to work in what we are calling gain-loss framing. So suppose that a patient or a physician is presented with two possible products. So product A has the promise of relieving a third of all symptoms within 1 week's time. So we call this gain framing because we're highlighting what stands to be gained by taking this medication. Product B, on the other hand, involves a bit of uncertainty. On the one hand, there's the possibility that you'll be in great shape and rid of all your symptoms in a week. But there's also this 2/3 probability that you'll be no better off than you were before you even took the medication. So in this case, most people prefer the certainty of being at least a little bit better off. So now suppose we modify our framing of product A so that instead of highlighting the gain of a third of symptom relief, we instead highlight the loss that is the 2/3 of symptoms remaining. In this loss framing, the preferences actually completely shift. And now people prefer product B, even though the description has not changed at all. So because we are so loss averse, we prefer a little bit of uncertainty, which is typically very aversive, if it is accompanied by the possibility of gaining instead of losing. So here again is a non-pharma but real world example of framing in practice. I think that this is, again, a really nice demonstration. So as a means of retaining customers, an Italian telecom company started offering a free credit of 100 calls to customers in order to keep their business. This example is a little hard to relate to in the age of unlimited talk and text. But they basically said to customers as they called in to cancel to close their accounts, they said, "We will credit your account with 100 calls if you keep your account." Now, they didn't see much success until they made a very subtle change to the script and instead said, "We have already credited your account with 100 calls. How could you use those?" So this completely changed the customer's perspective and made them feel as if those calls were already theirs, and importantly, theirs to lose. So now that we've talked about breaking old habits and encouraging new purchases and new prescribing decisions, let's talk a bit about how to sustain those behaviors over time and turn them into new habits. So why is it that the diet always starts tomorrow? So people have a really hard time following through even on the best of decisions and the best of intentions over time. One reason for this is that we place an exorbitantly high value on the present and discount the future. This is what we call present bias. Because many health-related decisions involve costs that are incurred in the here and now and payoffs that are delayed, those discounted rewards sort of pale in comparison and make it really difficult to follow through on a desired behavior. Another phenomenon that sort of complicates decision-making over time is called hot-cold empathy gaps. So when we're in a sort of visceral hot state, so for example, if we're hungry or angry or in pain, we kind of underestimate the extent to which that state is influencing our decisions. And we can't accurately predict what our preferences will be in the future when we're in a different cold state. So these temporal discrepancies are important. They're especially important for the treatment of chronic conditions. So we're going to talk briefly about 2 ways that intertemporal choice can be improved. So the first is by establishing new habits to replace the ones that we wanted to get rid of 2 sections back. So it's important now to think about the concept of a habit loop. So a habit loop is a recurring cue that results in a reward. So basically you have these 3 important components, right? You have a cue that initiates the process by kind of reminding an individual of the link between a behavior and a routine, a behavior that is, and a reward. So you have this behavior that is routinely associated with the release of dopamine and the activation of the reward system in the brain. And the cue then reminds you of that link and the fact that this behavior is probably going to result in something good. So in an effort to establish and reinforce such habit loops, you need to ensure that there's the presence of both the cue and the reward. So let's begin with cues. So these are essential because oftentimes people with limited attention or cognitive resources simply forget to carry out behaviors that are good for them. So one very simple intervention that health insurance and pharma companies have from time to time implemented is to simply call or text reminders to people in an effort to increase medical adherence. So there was a 2012 meta-analysis that showed that this approach increased adherence rates by more than 10 percentage points. And it's so simple and very cost effective. Another approach is to develop messaging that establishes new cues for a habit loop where maybe it didn't exist before. So this example comes from China, where fewer than 10% of patients were consuming the correct dosage of calcium supplement milk. So the company started this messaging campaign that encouraged drinking 2 glasses of milk when visiting one's parents, which I guess in China is apparently something people do on a daily basis, so it works. The new cue was seen as, the new cue was seeing one's parents, and the habit became drinking the appropriate dose of high calcium milk. In a similar vein, you can also help people to establish their own cues to encourage following through on behavior. Research has shown that having people make plans and visualizing an action actually increases the likelihood that they will carry out the action. For example, in an effort to encourage people to get the flu vaccine, researchers called people and either had them write down the date that they plan to go to get their vaccine, or to write down the date and time that they would go. So this simple change in the prompt forced people in the latter condition to really think about their day and the types of tasks and activities that they would be performing on that day. And then those activities became a cue for the behavior of going and getting vaccinated. So we saw a larger increase in the vaccination rates for that condition. So the other component, the reward component of this habit loop is arguably even more important. This is what encourages people to really continue the behavior in the face of adversity or just alternative options. Despite this, we're actually going to dedicate very little time to this topic, just because many of you probably have a very good understanding of the extrinsic rewards that can be introduced to strengthen the habit loop. But I will note that an expansive literature has emerged in behavioral economics, kind of adjudicating between different types of rewards and delivery methods to determine which has the largest impact and is the most cost effective. So I just include a brief discussion here of the idea of medium maximization, which features a lot in this literature. So this idea is that people place a surprisingly high value on mediums like points or tokens that are just symbolic. I mean, they have no intrinsic value whatsoever. So studies have found that people will exert time and effort and forego superior options, superior rewards, for those options that give them more of these kind of inherently worthless items. So this is one example that is probably very well known to most marketers of how you can introduce a reward to enforce a habit loop at little or no cost. All right, so finally, pre-commitment offers a way of overcoming a lot of the problems associated with present bias and hot-cold empathy gaps that we introduced earlier. So as we discussed, many long-term positive health outcomes entail immediate costs, and people in the present might not want to incur those costs. Similarly, someone in a hot state, so for example, someone who is maybe experiencing the unpleasant symptoms of a condition and who is thus really motivated to take a medication, might overestimate his or her intention of taking the medication when they're no longer in that same state. So the idea of pre-commitment is that you kind of tie your hands to an action that you're going to ultimately take in the future. So the classic examples of these are putting the alarm clock across the room so you have to get out of bed to turn it off. So the you that's going to sleep right now doesn't have to deal with this, but your future self is going to be waking up at 6 a.m. The other example is buying a smaller bag of chips, even though it's relatively more expensive, just so that you won't be able to eat more than you think you should. So an example of this from healthcare involved a home delivery patient. So these patients were reluctant to switch away from their current medication, as we discussed earlier, because switching medications feels like a loss. And it's one that people don't really want to incur, or at least not in the present. However, when patients were presented with the option of pre-commitment, so they could basically consent to make their future selves incur that cost, it was really effective. And more than half of the patients who were presented with this offer ended up switching to a low-cost alternative. So I hope that this has provided you with a good overview of the field and some of the concepts that are most relevant to the work that you do in pharmaceutical and healthcare market research. This is by no means exhaustive. The discipline of behavioral economics has much more to offer than what we were able to get through in this short session. But even in this short time, I hope you've learned about the importance of understanding the psychological biases that can undermine decision-making, and how behavioral economics can be leveraged to improve your marketing strategies, increase your market share, and overall help your patients and physicians make better decisions. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Allison, to walk us through a case study to see how some of these concepts can be applied.
Great, thanks, Erin. And I just want to sidebar. I know that there has been a bit of what sounds like typing, but it actually seems to be some systematic static. So thank you everyone for being patient and hanging in there. It seems to have gone away. So hopefully we're in the clear. But yes, now I'm going to bring you through a case study demonstrating how we can leverage some of these theories and tools that Erin has just discussed. So this example was conducted over multiple phases. In the interest of time and simplicity, I'm only going to touch on each phase at a really high level. So some background on this research. The client's new product with superior efficacy data was launched into a pretty crowded marketplace last year. And the prescribing data is just not as strong as anticipated for this best-in-class product. And the question that we need to answer is why? Why are physicians not adopting this new best-in-class product, and how can we modify our communications to increase their prescribing behavior? As I mentioned, this research was conducted over multiple phases in the communication development process. The first stage was a qualitative exploration to uncover and diagnose the heuristics that were influencing behavior in the physician's decision-making process when treating our target patients. Next, we wanted to create a new communication strategy that was going to allow our product to really break through this crowded competitive landscape. And we did this through leveraging traditional MACSDIF, but also incorporating that psychological implicit association testing that Erin had mentioned. Finally, once the new campaign was developed, we wanted to validate those communications through the use of applied neuroscience and cognitive measures. So the objective of this initial exploration phase, again, was to understand the physician's decision-making process and understand what those heuristics were that were at play. Now, there was a lot of different things that were uncovered, but among some of those mental shortcuts that were influencing the behaviors were things like representative heuristics. So what we found was that in this crowded competitive space where several new products had recently launched, physicians were just truly overwhelmed with the new information and the clinical data. They had this tendency of profiling patients and categorizing them into previously developed buckets in their mind. And from here, they defaulted to prescribing similarly to how they had in the past, without really critically looking at all the current options that were available for that unique patient and scenario. Another set of heuristics that were identified was the status quo bias and risk aversion. So physicians, they see their current treatment plan as essentially good enough for the patient. They don't want to risk switching a patient to a new product and a dosing schedule once that patient had achieved compliance on their current therapy. While compliance is essential in all treatment areas, precise dosing and timing and routine was really vital to the stability of this specific patient group. And physicians were hesitant to disrupt that patient's routine once they had really become in stride with this current therapy, even though the quality of life might have increased with the more efficacious treatment. So at the conclusion of this qual, we know that our current core messages were just truly not breaking through the noise of the competitive space. Physician behaviors in general had not been disrupted, and the benefits of our product were clearly not being delivered or making an impact that really they rationally should be. So next, we wanted to identify a new communication strategy that would better influence those behaviors and overcome the barriers identified in the qual. Here, specifically in this case study, we're going to focus on just the portion of differentiation and breakthrough of that competitive landscape. Leveraging a tool such as the psychological implicit association testing allows us to go deeper than some of the more traditional means of assessing a competitive landscape, such as perceptual mapping. So what an IIT actually does is it taps into a physician's internal biases about the current brands in the market and how these biases are maybe influencing their prescribing behavior. So as Erin briefly touched on, implicit testing and the way we're using it here is a timed reaction developed to reveal those unbiased perceptions about concepts that we might not be consciously aware of or really able to articulate. So when we pair the implicit test with a traditional max diff, we're really nicely able to uncover the top drivers for prescribing via the max diff, and then those current perceptions of the competitive landscape via the implicit. And what it does, it really unveils these white spaces in the market. So in this instance, we see that efficacy and fast acting are those top drivers for prescribing from that physician's viewpoint explicitly. Now, despite our product's best-in-class efficacy, we are not being highly or strongly associated with efficacious. And we see that in the implicit, actually, efficacious is only a medium association. It's important to note, though, that competitive product number 3 is highly associated with efficacious, and that no product actually is highly associated with fast. But we know that that's the second top driver for prescribing. So knowing this and understanding this dynamic between drivers and perceptions it's really recommended to differentiate our brand by pairing our best-in-class efficacy data with also the strong rapid relief data to fill this white space and really better differentiate our product in the physicians' minds. So next, these learnings, along with those from qualitative, were leveraged by the brand team for the modification of the strategy, positioning, and creative. And so finally, when the new communications were developed, we needed to validate, we wanted to validate the shift in attitudes and behaviors by benchmarking against the previous campaign, or the current campaign, if you will. So here we integrated measures from neuroscience, as shown on the left here, with some more cognitive response, your traditional qualitative, quantitative, and things of that sort. And it was interesting because we were able to really validate that using some of these tools from behavioral economics, such as framing and the decoy effect, we're able to actually shift perceptions. So for example, framing the same efficacy data in two different ways can have vastly different physiological effects. So in this case, framing the efficacy data as 65 to 75%, instead of how it was previously shown, which was up to 75%, resulted in a more engaged physician. And this is shown by their increased attention, making that message really more impactful. And we were able to pinpoint this by looking at the physiological response, actually of heart rate, which is a direct measurement, or I'm sorry, an indirect correlation with attention. Another theory that we leveraged was eliminating the decoy. So while our product's rapid relief data was superior to both competitors in the head-to-head comparison, incorporating that competitive product number 2 that was more similar and closely related to ours was actually diminishing the impact of our data. It was essentially a decoy. So by focusing that head-to-head data with only competitive product number 3, it resulted in physicians reporting our data to be actually more motivating than in the original campaign. And going further, if we remember back to our implicit test, competitive product 3 was identified as highly associated with efficacy. So this shift in strategy really allows us to now differentiate ourselves from that competitive product number 3 that's currently owning that efficacious space. It allows us to differentiate ourselves beyond just being an efficacious product. We're an efficacious product that has really fast-acting relief. So in the end, we are really able to make an impact on the projected prescribing behavior by leveraging these different tools and understanding these fundamentals of behavioral economics as we go through the research process. And it's looking at tools that we've been using all along, from qualitative and laddering and projections and things of that sort. And it's putting a lens over it. So it's not reinventing the wheel, it's looking at things with a little different perspective. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of the webinar. So I want to thank Erin so much for joining us today, and everyone that's tuned in. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them in that Q&A section of the platform, and we'll be happy to answer them now. Or if time doesn't allow, we're going to follow up with you right after we finish. So I see some questions rolling in. And let's start with this one. So when detailing a physician, what approach should the sales rep use to embed the concept of habit into the positioning pitch? So Kathryn, why don't you take this one?
Great, thank you. So as we know, what Erin shared earlier, the habit loop consists of a reoccurring cue, routine, and reward. So a habit, like prescribing a certain medication, is reinforced with repetition, and it develops a form of brand loyalty. The physician has association from previous experiences prescribing competitors to other patients, which diminishes the initial negative concerns for components such as side effects, since it doesn't interrupt the quote unquote reward frequently enough in the past to assert attention to it. In order to break the habit loop, there must be a form of incentive to encourage an alternate reaction known as a competitive response to disrupt the routine flow. Changing the opinion of the physician through exposure to advantageous features may change their preferences, which ultimately affects their choices. By maintaining and promoting the drug's habit advantages and honing in on the benefits compared to other competitive drug brands, it will encourage physicians to be more susceptible to exploration. Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, great. And I do see one of the questions is, will we be sending this presentation out? Yes, everyone will get a copy. But another great question is, at what point is behavioral economics applied to brand messages? So I think that we kind of address this a little bit with tools like framing. So in the case study example, framing a message from 65 to 75% instead of up to 75% is a way that you could really look at the way that you're presenting a message, and just by, it's the same message, just slightly tweaked, can have a different impact. Erin, I don't know if you have anything else that you would want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that you've covered it. I think that the language that you're using in the detail aids or in any kind of marketing can really, even just the most subtle shifts can have resounding effect on the way that that the product is perceived. So, and I think that the example that you presented in your case study is a really good way of demonstrating that. So I wouldn't add.
Okay. Well, here's another one, Erin. I'm gonna toss your way. So prospect theory. How can you balance or determine whether the loss is worth the perceived gain? This is something difficult trade-off for doctors to make with their patients. Okay,
yeah, that's a really good question. So what I can tell you is that the research that's been done in behavioral econ, so they basically looked at people's decision making in different types of gambles, different types of trade-offs, and they've been able to sort of create a loss aversion parameter. So it's basically a measure of how powerful loss aversion is, and it's usually it varies a great deal by domain, but it's usually like around 2. So the idea is that you have to be twice as good. This is, again, not at all a rule of, like a rule that you want to, or, don't want to hang your hat on it, but it's, it kind of gives you a sense of what it would take to sort of overcome that status quo bias. And for sure, it will vary depending on how attached the person using the medication is to that medication. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. And I see a couple questions that are very similar to each other, and essentially, hopefully I'll be able to kind of roll them all up into one. But essentially the question is, how do you really design research using behavioral economics measures and uncover these types of heuristics? And I think it's important to note that behavioral economics is, these tools in our toolbox, they're not specific methodologies and things like that. It's using and leveraging techniques that have been around and that we've all been using for forever, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, and things like laddering and indirect questioning and system 3, and a little bit more on the newer side, but or recently adopted in the industry, things like implicit tools. and really just kind of putting this behavioral economics lens over things and approaching things from a little bit of a different perspective, with a different, essentially from your side, a different framing, a different mindset. But Erin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I keep having to unmute. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what's nice about the relationship between heuristics and biases is that a lot of times the latter is informative of the former. So you can see in the kinds of errors and the kinds of deviations from what is optimal, it gives you sort of a hint about what the heuristics are that are being used to arrive at that. So a lot of times you can sort of, like, there are unique predictions. Like, if you're using this heuristic, then we would most likely see this particular bias. And so that's one way of sort of uncovering what heuristics are at work.
Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of plays off, this question plays off nicely, but some of the tools that we were talking about are more non-conscious or implicit. So does this ever differ from a more explicit type of response?
That's for me. Yes, oftentimes the implicit will differ from the explicit. So I've sort of couched all of behavioral econ as this look at why people being irrational relative to these like norms, and people want to be rational, right? So if you ask someone their opinion of a product explicitly, they're gonna put some thought into it, and they want to give you the rational answer because they want to seem like they are rational, and that, so they'll actually be deliberative, and they'll think through all of the pros and cons and arrive at the answer that they want to give to you. But they might have an emotional response that is based on some experience they had a long time ago, or an ad that they saw, or just like a negative, some negative word of mouth that affected them, and that can influence their decision-making at a subconscious level. And they're not even aware of it. But in that moment where they're making a snap judgment and making a purchasing decision, out of habit, or just in the moment and quickly, they're going to rely more on the implicit associations than on, some sort of explicit outcome or decision that they took a while to arrive at in the case of like market research.
Right. And this is something we come a lot across, especially with more of the physiological measures, right? They're the autonomic response, right? We're not able to really control or put thought into our heart rate. But it's almost, the stance of, we use some of these different tools like the non-conscious, whether it be physiological measures or implicit, because they do add a different perspective, right? We wouldn't do them, we wouldn't utilize them, they wouldn't be valuable if they were always just validating what we were able to get out of a traditional explicit type of question. Therefore, that's where kind of the magic, if you will, happens, or really the interesting and in-depth stories occur, is when there is this little bit of a disconnect, and understanding why that is and what types of things are at play and what's driving the stated response, and what that maybe gut visceral response is what's really interesting and of value, and really uncover a lot more insights. So great, keep rolling with the questions, everyone. So Kathryn, why don't you take this one? But can implicit be done on brands that haven't been launched yet?
Sure. So in terms of implicit, that actually is not possible, since implicit is, like we described earlier, it detects strength of the automatic associations based on past experiences. So in a situation where a brand has yet to be launched, there's essentially a blank slate for consumers. So we would say that is not possible.
Okay. Great. And let's see. There's a couple questions that are a little bit more specific, and we want to follow up with you after the responses might be a little bit nuanced or lengthy, and we want to make sure we give it the proper thought and time behind it. But with that, I want to thank everyone so much for joining. If we didn't get to your question, because it is potentially a little bit more nuanced, we're going to follow up with you right after this. Everyone is going to receive a recording of the webinar, as well as a copy of the deck for your reference. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us that were on today. We would be more than happy to discuss anything further. If you have anything that we didn't talk about, we would be more than happy to speak with you about that. So again, thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone's time, and have a great day and great weekend.